This is Delhi. Please stand by for our next program. This is All India Radio. In our national program of talks tonight, we bring you a panel discussion entitled R K Narayan, the man from Malgudi. The panelists are Ravi Singh, renowned publisher, Humra Qureshi, well known writer and columnist, Preeti Gill, well known literary agent and author, and Renuka Narayan, author and columnist who moderates and initiates this discussion.
Good evening and welcome to the National Program of Talks. This evening we are going to be discussing an iconic Indian writer, R K Narayan. Rasipuram, Krishnaswami, Narayanswami actually. And we have with us an eminent panel. There's Preeti Gill, who's a writer and a literary agent. There's the eminent publisher Ravi Singh and a very well-known author and columnist Humra Qureshi. I'm Renuka Narayanan, your host. I'd like to begin by briefly stating that R K Narayan lived for the longest time between 1906 and 2001. He was a witness to the 20th century, and he runs like a silver thread through the tapestry of Indian literature, of modern Indian literature, because lots of people have read him, if not now, then once upon a time. My father had his books in his library because Swami and Friends came out in 1935, and it came out through the kind offices of the English writer Graham Greene, published in London, after being rejected several times in India. So perhaps I should begin by asking Ravi Singh, would you publish R K Narayan today?
Yes, because the writing is remarkable. I think it would be fair, and some people say that it's also unremarkable in the themes that he wrote about and the characters he created, which, he ruffled no feathers and they're like warm, comforting. But on the other hand, I think that is what he consciously wanted to do, to write about small places, small people. So, yeah, I don't think he would be a major star today, and with good reason, I think. But he would be like a nice warm drink.
Hot chocolate on a winter evening?
Coffee on a winter evening by the fireside, that kind of thing. But fireside and all, it's too anglicized. Fortunately, he wasn't that, even though he wrote in English. But no, I think he definitely, I mean, not just me, any publisher, a sensible publisher would publish him if we were writing today. But no, he certainly wouldn't be an icon, no.
Why do you say that? What were his defects, if one can presume to call it that?
I think the writing was droll, which is all right. But I think now we expect a deeper engagement with your society and with life in general, I suppose. Because there is also there's been so much writing which has broken many rules, which has been very inventive and has engaged with the world with greater vigor. So he is, as I said, they're gentle soap operas.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, I would say he did his bit in his time, which was in colonial India, and he created his own world, or rather a world that nobody else knew about. And that was probably why he was picked up and published abroad, because he brought in India to the rest of the world that nobody knew about. The imaginary town of Malgudi, all these little characters busy with their little lives. Michigan's University printed his books. Hamish Hamilton printed his books. So some very reputable publishers in the Western world brought R K Narayan to their world and actually to ours. I think he wrote in his time, so not everybody transcends all epochs. So there's a certain slice of India that he brought to us, which those who are interested may still relish. Which is why I'd like to ask Preeti, would you, as a festival director, feature R K Narayan as a guest speaker? Would he draw a crowd in Amritsar?
Yeah, because I think there are a couple of reasons why we all connect with R K Narayan. He also writes in a style and of an age which was innocent of the many things that have happened in this country since then. Perhaps what he saw and described in his books, because he was really not a very political writer at all. He was not really touching even on society's many problems, as many other writers of his time had done, even in English. Mulk, for example.
But he did write about the abuse of women. In the
He
dark
did,
room.
yes. He did write about women, he did write about the poor, he wrote about people who were, say, the so-called middle class of that time. And the middle class of that time is very different from the middle class of today as well. So, but yes, he is very much a writer of that time. And it was opening a window to the India of that period, that time. That is one way of connecting, because it is a period piece and you would want to read that kind of history, which is what Malgudi and his time is all about. But also because I think he would connect to small places in India even today, because many of the concerns, many of the kinds of people or the characters he describes, or the lives he describes, are very similar to lives in small places in India or in villages in India even now. Many of those problems exist. Many of those, even the so-called development issues which would have been there, are still present in the country. So on many levels, I think one would be able to connect with the reality of those times. And I think, therefore, whether it's Amritsar or whichever place, you would definitely have an audience for something like that.
Oh, Humra, you mentioned that you read The Man-Eater of Malgudi. How did you gather your impressions of R K Narayan?
For me, when I saw that series, on the television,
Malgudi Days?
I was really drawn to it. There was something very innocent and yet very, there was something relaxing, in the sense, because he just touched on the ordinary people. And the fact that he never tried to sell his works, I mean, that is a very important thing for me. That a writer sitting quietly and yet his works are going on, because there must be some connect with the reader, with the person who's viewing the series. I found it something very solid.
Now, I think you mentioned a similarity with another writer, Indian writer, Preeti.
A similarity which just came to mind because I think R K Narayan was a really good storyteller. So whether even in each of his short stories, some were very, 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 very short, just a few pages, but he always left you guessing at the end. So he had all those essential ingredients that a good short story requires. His language was mostly simple. There wasn't that much complexity. There was not that much layering of, various things that you're trying to stuff inside one story. So
No showing off, in other words.
Yes, and so in many ways he reminds me of somebody like Ruskin Bond, for example, who you connect to on that level of pure, sheer good storytelling. And Ruskin also appeals to younger readers, therefore.
R K Narayan had his detractors, notably in the form of the two Shashis, Shashi Tharoor and Shashi Deshpande, who wouldn't relate to his work at all. And yet you have Narayan's works being compared to that of William Faulkner, his short stories being compared to that of Maupassant. And recently Jhumpa Lahiri wrote quite a pain about him, a very appreciative piece. So it's interesting that somebody who wrote so simply about a simple little world and yet had something in it that reached beyond. In my case, I would say, I find his stories under the simplicity very dark and disturbing because nothing is easy. Swami and Friends is an unhappy ending. All the other books have unhappy endings mostly. Nothing is simple. And it's not like you have things nicely tied up and everyone being jolly over a glass of rasam. It's heartbreaking. The English teacher was really disturbing and sad, and I believe it was autobiographical. So are we actually seeing something that the Western world related to? Because Narayan himself apparently was influenced by the great 19th century English novel, Hardy and Dickens and people like that, though he also read Woodhouse apparently and enjoyed the lighter writing. But there is that undercurrent of darkness in Narayan's writing, which is why I actually found it very disturbing to read him when I was a young thing. Ravi, if you were to pick this up as a theme, like people have noir publications, would you perhaps include Narayan among your noir writers?
No.
Why is that?
Because noir is a very specific kind of thing, it is grittier than what Narayan would even have wanted to write.
I see.
But there's just one point that it just occurs to me, it may not really be entirely accurate. But when you say that, in the West, he was loved and discovered and liked and
Lauded.
yes, lauded too. I think the 30s onwards, mid 30s, and in Europe, it was a dark period. I mean, there was, there was fascism, Nazism. The intimations of war had already started, and there was general disillusionment in society, even among intellectuals, etc. And people like Graham Greene, for instance, who was very, very political and deeply engaged with what was happening there. So now, I don't mean this. This isn't necessarily a disparaging thing, but then you have this gentle writer from India. And also, I think people like Graham Greene wouldn't have been natural supporters of colonialism, the empire, the Raj, and you had somebody. So it was, I think, in some ways, I think Greene did say something that it was heartwarming, it charming, etc., and it's sunshine, it was bright. And yes, you can understand why.
That's surprising when we've just been talking also about the very dark undercurrent in Narayan's work.
But with dark undercurrents, when we say, I think things can get much darker than what R K Narayan acknowledged in his stories. I mean, there's the book that you said very, about abuse, but
The Dark Room.
But sure, I mean, there are much, as Preeti was saying, Mulk Anand's Kuli, Untouchable. Those are, there you would say that, the dark side of society was explored much better than I would say.
Is it the sole task of fiction to report misery in its grittiest?
Well, no, of course not. But then, but that's what I'm saying. People expect different things and relate to works differently. And I don't think, if it isn't very attractive to be reporting misery, I don't think it's very attractive to also be doing, misery light.
Well, now you've reminded me of something Jane Austen famously said, let other pens dwell on misery. So perhaps Narayan made his choices accordingly. But Humra, what attracted you about Malgudi days that you remember it so well even now?
The simplicity and the uncomplicated style. It was nothing heavy or something that was a burden. I mean, that's a very, very big thing.
It's an interesting point.
Like he and Mulk lived around the same time. While reading Mulk Anand, there was a lot of stress. It was not a relaxed reading at all.
Okay.
And one does actually look forward to something which is innocent.
So that sounds like what Ravi said about Graham Greene and the West being receptive to Narayan's particular style because of the turmoil in their lives.
And
That's
one
interesting.
thing that is a little strange in a way that when he lived, there was this total political churning going on.
Right.
But he kept himself away.
That's right.
Which is...
more or less.
I don't know, which is a little surprising.
Well...
Because a writer does not live in a vacuum. There's a huge political turmoil going on. Like Mulk jumped into it. But
what about his right to choose?
Yeah, of course. Writing is very personal.
Yeah.
Very personal. But
Yeah.
it just leaves you a little...
See,
questions come up.
I tell you now, like for instance, there are lots of writers today who recycle news stories into their fiction. And then you wonder, why are you
It's a very
paying to
personal
read
thing.
something that the news has already given you?
I think that's a little unfair.
Yeah, because
No,
there's
I mean,
more.
sometimes it strikes you. Sure, they might put their creative spin on it and so on, granting full measure to all of that. But very often you see that the news has become is being retold as fiction. And so you really wonder, did Narayan not have the right then
No, it's not a very personal thing.
No. Yes, sorry.
to choose his own bandit? What do you say, Preeti?
No, that's all fine. What I feel about R K Narayan mainly is this whole thing of building up Malgudi, which I think was his strong point. I mean, you have
was
this
passionate
place,
about
and we all
Yeah, if
managed
you can have Hogwarts, you have Malgudi
and
too.
which
You're
you
correct,
can, it's a place that you actually see, because throughout his fiction, he's building up this one place with its many characters, with its lives, with whatever's going on over there. Nothing is like earth-shakingly catastrophic or hugely traumatic or whatever. But in every little life, there is the little
Some
drama
story.
that happens in every life. And those are the things that are his strong point. The fact of being able to create this entire world, which is such a realistic, believable world. And so much so that people actually went out and tried to find this
Find
place where it, where does this Malgudi actually, what has he actually used as his starting point, which was entirely imaginary. But the fact that he created it, and so similarly with Ruskin Bond, I mean, you have Masuri, you have Dera as that focal point, and all these lives
His
and all these
locale.
stories being told around that place. I think that for a writer who bases himself or his work in a certain region, that has its own
Appeal.
I think, appeal, beauty, whatever.
Appeal,
Building up of a certain.
Yeah.
He never went beyond that. So, I mean, whether it's politics or whether it's whatever
Yeah,
else.
he stayed in
didn't
Malgudi.
really
He
want
made
to.
Malgudi and stayed in it.
His
Also,
world.
as I said, is remarkable. He should always be read because he's a pioneer in some ways. But as you said, a writer has the right to choose. I think also readers have the right to
React.
React.
whether you like them for some reasons, but you feel there could be more. But there's a certain kind of writer. I don't think you can compare writers. But about Dark, I can see what you mean. I think while I admire him, what prevents kind of admiration or complete I'm not a fan, and that I think is because he is a traditionalist, and I'm no fan of traditionalists. It's
Could you define traditionalism?
what is the extent of even subversion or rebellion, even in a family setting that happens? Is that a young in one of the works, the son marries a white woman, and then his idea of the world is at odds with the idea of his father's and that generation, that kind of thing, which is charming, nice, and of course it happens in many families. But I think life is a little tougher than just that much. I can understand, every writers who make you smile, I love them. But writers who try to do a bit of this, a bit of that, gently and nice, they have their place, and one likes them gently.
So,
But also, it's almost, sort of the beginning of so-called writing in English in this country. So
there's-
you have to
Pioneering.
give him
Yeah,
that.
there is just one, we were talking about Mulk Anand, but we should also not forget
Raja Rao.
Raja Rao.
the serpent and the rope.
Was that, but before that, Kantapura, what a wonderful
Kantapura was
set in the
epic.
village, and it's also ordinary lives, and also I really, really, really like that book.
Yeah. I had the good luck to meet Raja Rao long ago. And it was very impressive because he was so modest and quiet. And I remembered that because of what Umra said about R K Narayan being so low-key and not pushing himself
Totally,
forward.
But also, it was a different time.
It was a different time
in
when
which writers
people
didn't
were
need to be pushy
didn't
and
tom
promote
quite
themselves
so
and-
much. And all his promotions were done by other people, which is so interesting. When you compare it, as you said, to today, when everybody has to toot their own toot so loudly to be noticed in the clamorous bazaar. So the thing about Narayan is that how did such a quiet person whose calling card was ordinariness have these interesting experiences? When he went abroad on a Rockefeller scholarship to America, he was invited to lecture at some very prestigious universities. He finally met his benefactor, Graham Greene, for the one and only time. And then he met, apparently, Greta Garbo. And she apparently asked him hard-hitting questions on Indian philosophy, which he flatly refused to answer, saying, I have no experience in this field. And yet, Narayan was told that he should write about the epics, that it was his cultural duty to write about the epics. So he translated the 9th century Kamba Ramayana from Tamil to English. And it took him several years. And then he translated the Mahabharata as well, which is no easy task because the Bharatam is full of action. Vyasa doesn't sit around for a moment. So he did that. It was a real tapasya, according to me. And nobody knows about those books as much as about Swami and Friends and about the whole Malgudi construct. Why is that, do you think? What is it, Ravi?
Yeah, I think they're retellings of, so maybe they weren't seen as original works. And so, original works are always privileged as greater art. Maybe that's why.
Okay. But I don't think anybody attempted telling Kamba Ramayana in English. Of course, the broad bones of the story are known.
Yeah, but as I said, maybe they were a little challenging for readers abroad, whereas in India they already knew these epics. So what are you bringing? And he didn't really play with the epics or do anything. It wasn't. They weren't the fictional equivalent of, let's say, Karve.
Iravati Karve's Suganta.
He was gently telling them. Retelling them. And in fact, I think if you look at his retellings of, I think his retelling of the Kamba Ramayana, I really like that. But his retelling of the Mahabharata, I thought it kind of, made it kind of tepid.
Okay.
So maybe, I don't know. There are a number of reasons why, but I think original work always does get.
Though, mind you, when you move from one language to another, it's a transcreation, as certain literary people used to say in India in the last century. It's a transcreation. And none of us would have read the Russians or the French if it hadn't, or the Greeks or the Romans, if it hadn't been for wonderful English translations. So, and they pass seamlessly. You don't even remember the translator's name, you only remember the original writer's name. So that's a whole other field to be explored there, where Narayanan put his, not just a toe, but hopped right into those deep waters. But strangely, as you say, because there's so many competing versions of the epics, maybe, nobody's really picked it up and said, wow, this was hard work and you've done it. But there is a genre of writing to which I call it the Premchand legacy, and feel free to fight with me about this. And there was a whole period of translations from regional languages to English, annual bound volumes of short stories by various publishing houses, which gathered short stories from different Indian languages and put them together in English. The impression I formed, and I could be wholly wrong and I look to you all to correct me, was that some of the writing was very self-indulgent. In the sense, they just discussed the protagonist's moods and feelings and didn't lead anywhere. And everywhere else, it was absolutely in the Premchand format. It was almost like poverty porn, which was so extraordinary to read because surely people were living their lives too. So what do you think of this? Does Narayan actually part of the progenitor of this breed? What do you say, Preeti?
You encountered poor people in Narayan's work?
No, he's
No, of unhappiness. Of unhappiness.
I think it would be the opposite actually, because he wasn't really doing that. It was more like him actually showing you another
The lower middle class life.
the middle class life, but a life in a small town, which doesn't necessarily mean that all people are poor and all people are therefore unhappy or miserable. He was showing you, I think, a richer slice of life, or a more rounded way of, if you thought that all of India was only living in villages and was poor and therefore crying all the time, I don't think he was doing that. He was definitely showing you something more than that, and opening a different kind of window. But another thing that I do feel, and in that I think I agree with what Ravi was saying earlier, is that he could have been much richer in his detailing descriptions, the kind of social realities that existed at that time. So while he may venture a little bit into that area, like politics, for example, because it was British India, he could have talked a bit more about that in his stories. If Swami can throw a stone, surely he can do more than that, show you a bit more than that.
He ran away from home because of it.
Yeah, and so I just feel he gives you that little you just sort of touch upon it, but you don't go further. In a similar story, I think there was somewhere, I think it's in one of the Swami stories, where he has this boy that he really looks up to,
Rajam.
and then one day Rajam comes to his house and he is tinkering around with the camera or something which has been made by a Muslim classmate of his, and then he says something and he thinks Rajam is looking down on him because this camera is made by a Muslim classmate. And then he tells him he's a good Mohammedan because he talks against those Mohammedans who were like terrible, talking about various people from history. So now the thing is that you're making a comment like that in a story which is about schoolboys in a school, and yet you leave it at that point. So what I'm trying to say is just that, yes, you discuss certain things, or you don't discuss them, you just sort of
take you to
move
the
towards
brink,
it,
but
but you
don't
don't
go
go
there.
further than that. And these were all things that confronted us. I mean, whether it was...
These were living realities of
Exactly.
India.
So whether it's caste in a village, whether it's
religion,
communal feelings, or whether it is the British anti-Raj feelings, I mean, it's not like you can just completely sideline them. These are things which are as real to you as, like you said, an abusive husband. These are also realities. And I don't think he made that effort to go further, for whichever reason.
Did you find that Malgudi days was nevertheless interesting despite not touching on these important upheavals? Because you did say he should have. Did it
Should
still
have,
work
in
as
a
a
sense,
story?
I feel it has to come to a writer very naturally. Suppose there are confusions going on and turmoil and churning, because the writer is not living in some vacuum. Like Munshi Premchand, his depictions of the village life in Uttar Pradesh are actually real. I mean, I'm from UP, so I can relate, even now. So there is a contrast. This was all happy in the sense, not everybody's not giggling. I mean, this is a very middle class sort of thing going on, but in a very
Light and
concise sort of
gentle way.
A very concise way. Maybe he purposely didn't want to touch any of the sensitive stuff. But
So I guess we can look at it as one more brick in the documentary wall of Indian literature.
Yeah, probably.
That this is one more piece of recording slices of Indian life. Ravi, I wonder if there are any young writers today whom you feel are on the same bandwidth as R K Narayan.
There are a few, but as I said, I don't read them.
Oh, fair enough. So we actually in a very tricky situation where on the one hand you have the reality of R K Narayan, who was and who is, and who is cherished abroad, who is not always cherished at home, but nevertheless exists as a brick in the wall, and a big brick. Whether or not we relate to him today is left entirely to personal inclinations and proclivities. No one can deny that he documented us. It's like Kipling documented 19th century India, of course, at a much more intense and colourful scale. Similarly, Narayan documented his 2 inches of ivory, as Jane Austen might have called it, and he did it his way, with the little lives of little people in a little place.
And he did them well. Nobody can say that he was not interesting. He was never a boring writer. And I suppose even this is an indication of his endurance, and also a superior quality of him as a writer, is that you expect more of him.
That is a nice way of putting it.
A bad writer writing, not touching some things, doesn't bother you as much as a really good writer.
And also the kind of family he came from.
Yeah.
Because you
Gifted
had...
with R K,
Yes,
Lakshman.
Lakshman doing political cartoons which are
still
as relevant today as they ever were. So you
We
would
all
expect
grew up
it
with
also
them.
of the kind
Yeah.
of mahal you grow up in, the kind of family you come from, you do expect.
And I would like to conclude by recalling that R K Narayan made a very, very bold choice for the 1930s. He didn't get a regular job, despite being, just a school teacher's son. He chose to write. He chose to earn his livelihood by writing. And the incredible thing is his family supported him. And we can't imagine that happening so easily even today. And so I think in some ways it was quite an interesting and exemplary life in terms of making your personal choices and following through. On which happy note, I would like to thank all of you for your very interesting thoughts on somebody whom we can't forget, which is R K Narayan. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
In National Program of Talks tonight, you were listening to the panel discussion entitled R K Narayan, the man from Malgudi. The panelists were Ravi Singh, renowned publisher, Humra Qureshi, well-known writer and columnist, Preeti Gill, well-known literary agent and author, and Renuka Narayan, author and columnist who initiated and moderated the discussion. Produced and presented by Naveen K. Gupta of All India Radio Delhi, this program came to you from the Delhi station of All India Radio.